When you marry into organized crime, you marry the silence too. The code of omerta does not apply only to the men carrying guns and moving drugs. It applies to the woman sitting across from them at the dinner table. She knows the names, the operations, the money, and she is expected to take all of that to her grave. The women in these cases refused. They walked into courtrooms and police stations, and they talked. What happened afterward was not the same for any of them. One survived untouched. One spent decades hiding under a name that is not hers. One was murdered by the man she had testified against, her body dissolved in acid. One lives under a permanent death sentence in an undisclosed location. And one was found dead 10 days after going home to see her children, in circumstances that every investigator who looked at the case refused to call suicide. Today, we are covering the Mafia wives who testified against their own husbands and what happened to each of them for doing it. Anna Genovese, the only mob wife who testified against her own husband and got away with it. On March 2nd, 1953, a woman walked into a New Jersey courthouse and did something that had never been done before in the history of the American Mafia. She sat down in front of a judge in open court with reporters filling the room, and she started talking. She named names. She described the rackets. She put a dollar figure on everything her husband had ever earned through crime. And her husband, one of the most feared mob bosses in the United States, did absolutely nothing to stop her. Her name was Anna Genovese. Her husband was Vito Genovese. Anna was born Giovannina Petillo on October 28, 1905, in New York City, the eldest child of Italian Catholic immigrants. She grew up in the tight, insular world of Little Italy, where everyone knew everyone, and where certain men commanded a kind of respect that had nothing to do with honest work. In 1924, at 19 years old, she married her first husband, Gerard Velnotico, a baker. They had a daughter together, Marie, in 1927, and by all accounts it was a modest, ordinary life. Then, in March 1932, Gerard Velnotico was found strangled to death on the rooftop of a building in Manhattan. Nobody was charged with the murder. Nobody was ever convicted. But mob informant Joseph Valachi would later claim, years afterward, that Vito Genovese had ordered the hit. The reason, according to Valachi, was simple. Vito wanted Anna for himself. 2 weeks after her first husband was killed, Anna married Vito Genovese. She was 6 months pregnant at the time. Her great-niece later confirmed to researchers that Anna hated Vito, but felt she had no real choice. She was a widow with a young daughter, pregnant, in a world where men like Vito did not take no for an answer. The wedding happened fast, and Anna spent the next 2 decades learning exactly what kind of man she had married. Vito Genovese was not a minor figure. He was connected to Lucky Luciano, involved in the formation of the American Mafia as it became organized in the early 1930s, and was working his way toward the top of one of New York's most powerful crime families. He was also, by Anna's account, brutally violent toward her. She later alleged in court filings that he beat her regularly, breaking her nose on one occasion, setting her hair on fire with a cigarette on another, and blacking both of her eyes. She said the marriage had endangered her health and made her life extremely wretched. But while Vito was building his criminal empire, Anna was quietly building something of her own. In 1934, Vito was forced to flee the United States to avoid a murder charge and relocated to Italy, where he spent years in exile. This left Anna alone in New York with the children and a significant amount of mob money flowing through her hands. Rather than simply wait, she went to work. She began running a network of gay bars and drag clubs in Greenwich Village and Lower Manhattan at a time when gay establishments were technically illegal and routinely raided by police. Anna used Vito's mob connections to bribe local officers and protect the bars and their patrons. A portion of the profits went back to the syndicate. The rest was hers to manage. Her first club, Club Caravan, opened in 1939 and hosted some of the most prominent drag performers of the era. She later co-owned the 181 Club, which regulars described as the homosexual Copacabana. Anna was not simply running these places as a business calculation. She was bisexual. Her relationships with women were an open secret in the community. One gay bartender who worked in that world recalled years later that he had felt safer on the streets of New York than he had ever felt before because Anna Genovese had his back. Vito returned to the United States in 1945. The murder charge against him had collapsed after key witnesses died. He moved the family to New Jersey and effectively shut down Anna's life in New York. No more clubs, no more independence, no more income of her own. Their relationship, already poisoned by years of violence and distance, deteriorated further. By 1950, Anna had walked out. She left Vito and did not go back. She filed a legal complaint describing the marriage as a danger to her health and her life. She wanted financial support. She wanted out. Vito, for his part, filed a countersuit for divorce on the grounds of desertion. Both of them were about to end up in court. What nobody expected was what Anna would do when she got there. On March 2, 1953, Anna Genovese took the stand at the Freehold County Courthouse in New Jersey and testified in open court for 4 hours. She was 47 years old. She asked the judge for $350 per week in support from Vito, the equivalent of roughly $160,000 per year in current terms. And to establish why that sum was reasonable, she explained exactly how much money Vito was making and exactly where it came from. She told the court that Vito earned $20,000 per week from the Italian lottery alone. She testified that he owned nightclubs, horse racing tracks, and dog racing tracks. She said the family had been involved in narcotics trafficking, casinos, labor rackets on the New York waterfront, and prostitution. She claimed that she had personally handled between $20,000 and $30,000 per week in racket money, keeping it in safe deposit boxes in Red Bank, New Jersey, in New York, and in Europe. She described making trips to Italy herself, carrying large sums of cash to Vito during his years in exile. She said she was the only person with the combination to the family safe in New Jersey. She also told the court that she and Vito had once been the only American guests of Nazi Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring. She named other mob leaders who had attended parties at their home in Atlantic Highlands: Albert Anastasia, Frank Costello, the Moretti brothers, and Abner Zwillman among them. The courtroom was packed. Reporters were scribbling notes. This had never happened before. No mob wife had ever stood in open court and described the inner workings of her husband's criminal operation to a judge. The Mafia's code of silence, Omerta, applied to everyone inside the world, and the wives of powerful men were expected to stay quiet above all others. Anna Genovese broke that code in front of a full room and a press gallery, and she did it while asking for alimony. The result was predictable in one sense. Her testimony did not produce a criminal prosecution of Vito from this hearing alone. Both her maintenance suit and Vito's countersuit were eventually dismissed by the New Jersey Superior Court Appellate Division. She did not get the $350 per week she had asked for. The legal outcome was, on paper, a draw. But what happened next was not predictable at all. Because Vito Genovese, a man who had personally ordered murders, who had allegedly arranged the killing of Anna's first husband so he could marry her, who ran one of the most violent criminal organizations in the country, did nothing to Anna. He did not threaten her. He did not have her hurt. He did not have her killed. He sat in that courthouse and listened to his wife describe his entire criminal operation to a judge and a room full of reporters. And then he went home. The mob world was stunned. Joe Valachi, who would later become famous as a government witness himself, spoke about it directly. He said nobody could understand why Vito didn't do something about her. The word was all around, he said. Why doesn't he do something? But Vito, according to Valachi, genuinely loved Anna in some way that overrode everything else. Valachi said that years later, when he and Vito were both inmates at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Vito would sometimes talk about Anna, and Valachi would watch tears roll down his cheeks. Following the courthouse testimony, Anna was subpoenaed to appear before grand juries in Bergen County, Hudson County, and Mercer County, as well as before the New Jersey Law Enforcement Council. She appeared and gave the same answers. She named the same operations. She kept talking. And still nothing happened to her. Anna went on to manage Club 82, a mob-owned drag performance venue in the East Village, while her divorce proceedings dragged on. The case was eventually dropped entirely. They remained legally married for the rest of their lives, though they never lived together again. Vito Genovese continued his rise. In 1957, he took control of what had been the Luciano crime family, and it was renamed the Genovese crime family by the FBI, a name it still carries today. That same year, he was one of the New Jersey attendees at the now infamous Appalachian Mob Summit in upstate New York, which was raided by law enforcement, publicly exposing dozens of the country's top organized crime figures. In 1959, Vito was convicted of conspiracy to violate federal narcotics laws and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He tried to run the family from behind bars and died at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri on February 14, 1969. Anna outlived him by more than a decade. She lived quietly, out of the spotlight, working for a period at the Warwick Hotel in New York, where she reportedly became friendly with the actor Cary Grant, who was a long-term guest. She kept a low profile and stayed off the front pages. In 1982, Anna suffered a stroke and died at St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City. She was surrounded at the end by her daughter Marie, her granddaughter Mia, and her longtime companion, Jackie, a woman. In death, whatever peace Anna had tried to put between herself and Vito was undone by one final arrangement. She was buried next to him in the Genovese family vault at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, New York. Anna Genovese went her entire life without being touched for what she did in that freehold courthouse. She was the first mob wife in American history to testify openly against her husband, and she died of natural causes at 76. No retaliation came, no threats that have ever been documented. She simply walked out of the mob world on her own terms and lived the rest of her life. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next woman on this list was not nearly as lucky. Karen Friedman Hill entered witness protection with her children after her husband turned on the Lucchese crime family, only to discover that the government's protection came with an expiration date, and that the moment her husband's bad behavior got them expelled from the program, she and her kids were on their own, in a world where her family's real names were known to people who had very good reasons to want them dead. Karen Friedman Hill, the mob wife who embraced the life, lost everything, and has been hiding ever since. Henry Hill was not a made man. He was never going to be one. His father was Irish, which meant the Italian-American Mafia would never fully initiate him, regardless of how long he worked for them or how loyal he proved himself to be. But Henry Hill spent his entire childhood watching the men at Paul Vario's cab stand in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and he wanted that life more than anything else. By the time he was a teenager in the late 1950s, he was running errands for Lucchese family capo Paul Vario, and had already decided that legitimate work was for people who had no other options. Karen Friedman was not from that world at all. She was born on January 16, 1946, in Brooklyn, New York, and raised in a Jewish family that had nothing to do with organized crime. She was working as a dental hygienist when she met Henry in 1965, introduced through Paul Vario himself, who insisted Henry accompany his son on a double date at a restaurant called Villa Capra. By Karen's own account, the date was a disaster. Henry stood her up for the next dinner they had planned. And then somehow, against all reasonable logic, they started seeing each other anyway. What Karen saw in Henry Hill in those early years was what everyone around him saw: charm. He took her to the Copacabana, to clubs and restaurants where nobody waited in line and every door opened immediately. He had money, connections, and an energy that made ordinary life feel dull by comparison. She knew relatively quickly that he was not running a legitimate business, and by her own admission, she was not put off by this. She was drawn in. They married in 1965. Karen converted to Judaism for Henry, who got circumcised as part of the process despite having, as she later noted, a very hard time following rules of any kind. They had 2 children together, Greg and Gina. They built a life in the suburbs of New York, a life that looked comfortable and normal from the outside, and was anything but. Henry was a Lucchese associate involved in truck hijacking, arson, loan sharking, stolen merchandise, extortion, and eventually a narcotics operation that violated the direct orders of Paul Vario, who had forbidden his crew from dealing drugs. He was connected to Jimmy Burke, known as Jimmy the Gent, one of the most dangerous men in the Lucchese orbit, who was involved in planning what became the 1978 Lufthansa heist at JFK Airport. At the time, the largest cash robbery in American history, netting approximately $5 million in cash and $875,000 in jewels. Karen was not a passive bystander in any of this. When Henry was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for extortion in 1974, and the mob largely abandoned her financially, she started managing on her own. She visited Henry in prison and smuggled food and drugs inside for him to sell to other inmates. She later described this period matter-of-factly. It was what you did. You found a way. While Henry was in prison, things went badly in more than one direction. Tommy DeSimone, a volatile member of the crew, attempted to rape Karen. She resisted, and he beat her. She was also, during this period, having an affair with Paul Vario. It has been suggested that Vario subsequently had DeSimone killed, at least partly as a consequence of what he had done to Karen, though DeSimone's murder was attributed to a separate dispute involving the killing of a made man named Billy Batts. Henry was paroled in 1978 and immediately went back to work, deepening his involvement in cocaine trafficking despite Vario's standing prohibition. Karen participated in the drug business alongside him. Their household during this period was, by the account of their children, chaotic. Parties where people openly used drugs, money coming and going, a constant state of low-level paranoia that escalated as Henry's behavior became more erratic. On June 11, 1980, Henry was arrested on narcotics trafficking charges. The FBI had him. He was facing a sentence long enough to mean he would not see his children grow up. And on top of that, he had reason to believe that Jimmy Burke was already planning to have him killed to prevent him from talking. A $1 million bounty was allegedly on his head. Henry Hill was not a man built for martyrdom. He called the FBI. On May 27, 1980, Henry signed an agreement with the strike force and became a government informant. The decision was entirely his. Karen did not make it for him, and by her own account, she had no real warning before it happened. The family, Henry, Karen, Greg, and Gina, entered the United States Marshals Witness Protection Program in 1980, were given new identities, and began moving. Over the following years, they were relocated to multiple undisclosed locations: Seattle, Washington, Cincinnati, Ohio, Omaha, Nebraska, Butte, Montana, and Independence, Kentucky. They changed their names. The children could not tell their friends who they really were. Karen could not contact her family. Everything familiar was stripped away, replaced by a series of anonymous houses in cities where they knew nobody and were not supposed to stand out. Henry's testimony was significant. He testified against Lucchese capo Paul Vario, who had been his sponsor and protector for 2 decades. He testified against Jimmy Burke. His cooperation ultimately led to approximately 50 convictions. The government got what it needed from Henry Hill. What the government could not do was make Henry Hill behave. He was constitutionally incapable of living a quiet, law-abiding life in the suburbs of Cincinnati or Butte. He continued using drugs inside witness protection. He continued committing crimes. In the fall of 1981, he met a woman named Sherry Anders and married her in Virginia City, Nevada, despite the fact that he was already legally married to Karen. The bigamous marriage was one of several catastrophic decisions he made during this period that destabilized whatever remained of his family's situation. In 1987, Henry was convicted of cocaine trafficking in a federal court in Seattle. That conviction ended the family's participation in the witness protection program. They were expelled. Henry was out. Karen and their children were out with him. The protection they had given up their entire former lives for was gone. Karen filed for divorce in 1990 after 23 years of marriage. The divorce was not finalized until 2002, 12 years after she filed. Henry went on to remarry Sherry Anders and eventually fathered another child. He moved to the West Coast, became something of a public figure, collaborated with journalist Nicholas Pileggi on the book Wise Guy, published in 1986, and served as the basis for Ray Liotta's character in Martin Scorsese's 1990 film Goodfellas. He called the film approximately 95% accurate. He gave interviews, appeared on television, and seemed almost incapable of understanding that discretion was essential to staying alive. Martin Scorsese approached Karen's U.S. attorney, Edward McDonald, about using his office as a filming location during the production of Goodfellas. McDonald agreed and played himself in the film. Lorraine Bracco was cast as Karen. Bracco did not meet Karen before filming. Karen has never publicly discussed how she felt about the film or about being portrayed in it. Henry Hill died on June 12, 2012, at age 69, from complications related to heart disease in Los Angeles. He was reportedly surprised, more than once, that he had never been killed by the people he had betrayed. Karen Friedman Hill is still alive. She continues to use an alias. Her children, Greg and Gina, published a book in 2004 called On the Run, A Mafia Childhood, which described their experience growing up first inside the mob world and then inside witness protection. In it, Karen is described as someone who genuinely found the lifestyle glamorous in its early years, who fought to hold the family together through prison sentences and relocation and the constant threat of exposure, and who ultimately had the ground pulled out from under her by the man she had built her life around. The details of her current life are not public. The city she lives in is not known. Whether she remarried is not known. Henry's former manager confirmed she was alive as recently as 2012. She reportedly runs some form of small business, though that has never been independently verified. What is documented is that she has maintained her alias for decades and has no interest in being found. What makes Karen Hill's case different from Anna Genovese is that Karen did not choose to testify against her husband. She entered the protection program because Henry made a deal and she had no real alternative. She did not stand up in court and break omerta of her own volition. She was pulled into the machinery of her husband's cooperation the same way she had been pulled into the machinery of his criminal life, without full control over the outcome. She stayed hidden for years, not because she had something to gain, but because her husband's choices had made hiding the only safe option. The government asked Henry Hill to testify. Henry Hill testified. The government protected the family for 7 years, then expelled them when Henry's behavior made the arrangement untenable. Karen and her children paid the price for that expiration alongside Henry. But unlike Henry, they had not been the ones making the decisions that got them kicked out. She has been in the background ever since, living under a name that is not her own, in a place that nobody reports on, having outlasted the criminal world her husband loved, the protection program that failed them, and the husband himself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Unlike Karen Hill, Lea Garofalo made the choice to testify entirely on her own. Not to save herself from prison, but because she wanted her daughter to have a life that did not look like hers. The Italian government put her in witness protection, then stripped that protection away, then watched as the man she had testified against spent years patiently setting a trap for her that she walked into, believing it was a second chance. Lea Garofalo. She testified against the mob, lost her protection, and was dissolved in acid. Lea Garofalo was born on April 24, 1974, in Pettiglia Policastro, a small town in Calabria, the region that makes up the toe of Italy's boot. Her father was an 'ndrangheta boss. He was murdered when Lea was 8 months old. Her uncle was murdered when she was 7. Another relative was killed in front of her when she was 15. The village she grew up in had a population of roughly 400 people and recorded 35 murders in 30 years. Violence was not something that happened around her occasionally. It was the fabric of daily life. The 'ndrangheta is not the Sicilian Mafia. It does not have the same name recognition outside Italy, but inside the criminal world, it is considered the most powerful and most profitable organized crime organization on the planet. By 2010, it was estimated to control approximately 70% of the cocaine supply in Europe and generate revenues of around $100 billion per year. It is built entirely on blood ties. You are born in or you marry in. There is no other way. And once you are in, the organization owns you for life. Women in the 'ndrangheta do not have careers or independence or choices about who they marry. They exist to cement alliances, produce children, and maintain silence. Lea wanted out from the time she was a teenager. What she thought was her escape arrived in the form of Carlo Cosco. Cosco was from a farming family, or so she believed. He seemed to offer a path away from Pettiglia Policastro and the world she had grown up in. She married him at 16 and moved toward what she hoped would be a normal life in Milan. What she did not know, and what Cosco had deliberately concealed, was that he was a cocaine trafficker embedded in the 'ndrangheta. For Cosco, marrying the sister of a local boss was a professional advancement. It connected him deeper into the organization and gave him access to networks he would not otherwise have had. What Lea thought was love was, on his side, largely a strategic decision. The physical abuse began within the relationship early. Carlo was repeatedly violent toward her. She later described years of depression so severe that she made multiple attempts at suicide. Their daughter Denise was born, and Denise became the reason Lea kept trying to find a way forward. She told Italian police years later, "You do not really live in that world. You just survive in some way. You dream about something, anything, because nothing is worse than that life." In May 1996, Italian Carabinieri arrested Carlo Cosco in Milan, alongside other affiliates during a raid on a cocaine trafficking network. He was imprisoned. Lea, now free of him physically, made a decision. She was done. She wanted out of the 'ndrangheta entirely, and she was willing to tell the authorities what she knew to get there. In 2002, Lea went to the police as a testimone di giustizia, which in Italian law means a citizen informant without a criminal record. This is a legally distinct category from a pentito, which is a criminal who cooperates with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Lea had not been convicted of anything. She came forward voluntarily because she wanted protection and because she wanted Denise to grow up in a world that did not look like Pettiglia Policastro. She provided investigators with detailed information about drug trafficking operations run by the Cosco brothers. She described an internal conflict between the Garofalo and Cosco families that had left approximately 40 people dead. She implicated her own brother-in-law, Giuseppe Cosco, in the murder of her brother Floriano, who had been shot in the courtyard of her own home in 2005. She told them everything she knew. Lea and Denise entered the Italian Witness Protection Program in 2002. They were relocated to Campobasso, given false identities, and moved at least once per year. Lea took self-defense classes. She slept with a knife under her pillow. She was, by every account from people who knew her situation, permanently on edge, unable to trust that any location was truly safe. Denise was a child navigating a completely uprooted existence, unable to maintain friendships or any continuity because they were always moving, always under a name that was not theirs. Then, in 2006, the Italian government revoked Lea's protection. The official reason given was that doubts had emerged about the significance of her testimony and about her reliability as a witness. Lea challenged the decision through administrative appeals. The Regional Administrative Tribunal upheld the revocation. She appealed further. The Council of State eventually granted her a partial readmission to the program, but in a reduced capacity, as a judicial collaborator rather than a full protected witness. The practical difference in terms of security was substantial. She had fought to stay protected and had ended up with something considerably less than what she started with. She had spent 4 years hiding and moving and sleeping with a knife, and the state had looked at what she provided and decided it was not valuable enough to keep protecting her. What happened next is where the case becomes unbearable to follow in detail, because every step can be seen clearly in hindsight, and every step was a trap that Lea could not see. After the protection was reduced, Lea remained in Campobasso, but made the decision in April 2009 to voluntarily end her engagement with the program entirely. Her reasons are not fully documented. Her lawyer, Enza Rando, believed she was exhausted and had lost faith in the system after the 2006 revocation. There are also suggestions that Denise, now a teenager, was pushing for some kind of normalcy, for the possibility of knowing her father. Whatever the combination of reasons, Lea stepped back from the program and began re-establishing contact with people in Petilia Policastro. Carlo Cosco, who had by now been released from prison, re-entered her life. He was patient. He went on several dates with Lea in Calabria. He told her he wanted to reconcile. He said the family could be together again. He presented himself as someone who had changed, someone who understood what had been lost. Lea's lawyer urged her not to trust him. Rando told her directly not to go anywhere with him. Lea insisted that with Denise present, she was safe. She believed that Carlo would not do anything in front of their daughter. On May 5, 2009, one of Cosco's men entered Lea's home under false pretenses, with the intention of kidnapping and killing her. Denise happened to be home unexpectedly. The man left. Lea reported the attempted kidnapping to the Carabinieri. The investigation opened. And still, 6 months later, she agreed to travel to Milan with Carlo. The journalist Alex Perry, who wrote the book The Good Mothers about this case and others like it, described what Cosco was doing during those months as a diabolic double game. Every interaction with Lea during that period, the dates, the conversations, the promises, was performance. He was directing his crew to kill her the entire time. They kept failing to find the right moment. That is why he needed her to come to Milan. On November 20th, 2009, Cosco brought Lea to Milan, telling her the trip was to discuss Denise's university plans. On the evening of November 24th, while Denise was with other relatives, Cosco took Lea to an apartment. His brother Vito, known as Sergio, was already waiting there. Lea was strangled with a curtain cord. Her body was then handed to 3 of Cosco's associates, Carmine Venturino, Rosario Curcio, and Massimo Sabatino. They transported it to a warehouse in San Fruttuoso, a suburb of Monza outside Milan. Over the course of 3 days, they dissolved Lea's body in approximately 50 liters of acid. What remained, bones and more than 2,000 fragments, was buried on a plot of land at that site. Carlo Cosco told everyone, including Denise, that Lea had decided to run away to Australia to start a new life. Denise was 17 years old. She knew immediately what had actually happened. She told investigators later that she understood within days that her father had killed her mother. What she also understood was that she could not let him know that she knew. She went home with him. She acted normally. She pretended she believed the Australia story. She spent more than a year living inside her father's household, building his trust, feeding information to investigators whenever she could, while privately holding the knowledge of what he had done to her mother. She was also, during this period, in a relationship with Carmine Venturino, one of the men who had spent 3 days dissolving her mother's body in acid. She did not know his role at the time she began the relationship, and Venturino, falling in love with Denise and apparently unable to carry the weight of what he had done, eventually broke. He incriminated himself. He told investigators where the remains were buried. He provided the details that allowed the case to be built. Lea's bones and the more than 2,000 fragments recovered from the San Frutuoso site were identified through forensic analysis. The DNA evidence confirmed what had happened. The case came together. On October 2010, Italian magistrates issued detention warrants for Carlo Cosco, Vito Cosco, Giuseppe Cosco, Rosario Curcio, Massimo Savatino, and Carmine Venturino. Trial began and faced an early setback when a judicial appointment issue caused the initial proceedings to be annulled and restarted from the beginning. On March 30th, 2012, the court convicted all 6 defendants of kidnapping, torture, murder, and destruction of a corpse. Carlo Cosco, Vito Cosco, Rosario Curcio, and Massimo Sabatino were sentenced to life imprisonment. Venturino received a reduced sentence of 24 to 25 years, partly in recognition of his cooperation. Giuseppe Cosco was acquitted on appeal in May 2013 due to insufficient direct evidence of his personal involvement. The life sentences for Carlo Cosco and the others were confirmed by Italy's Supreme Court of Cassation in December 2014. The sentences became final. Denise Cosco, who had testified against her own father and whose testimony was central to the conviction, now lives under a new identity in a secret location. She is under the same witness protection program that stripped her mother of protection in 2006. The lawyer, Enza Rondo, who had represented Lea and urged her not to go to Milan, continued advocating afterward for reforms to Italy's witness protection laws, specifically for the category of citizen witnesses like Lea, who had no criminal record and whose protections were weaker than those given to convicted criminals who turned state's evidence. A public funeral for Lea Garofalo was held at Piazza Beccaria in Milan in 2013, 4 years after her death, once her remains had been formally identified. She was 35 years old when she died. She had spent 7 years trying to leave a world she was born into, and the state that was supposed to protect her for doing so had decided her information was not significant enough to justify keeping her safe. Her daughter carries that forward. Denise lives somewhere in Italy under a name that is not hers, and will do so for the rest of her life. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Giuseppina Pesce watched what happened to women in her world who stepped out of line, and she testified anyway, handing prosecutors 1,500 pages of evidence that dismantled one of the most powerful crime families in Europe, even after her own family used her children to break her once and nearly succeeded in pulling her back for good. Giuseppina Pesce, the boss's daughter who gave prosecutors 1,500 pages and condemned herself to hide forever. Rosarno is a small coastal town on the Tyrrhenian Sea in Calabria, the southernmost region of mainland Italy. It has a population of roughly 15,000 people. It is also, by the assessment of Italian anti-mafia investigators, one of the most comprehensively controlled towns in Europe. The Pesce family had run Rosarno and the surrounding Gioia Tauro plain for decades, not just through violence, though there was plenty of that, but through total economic and social penetration. They controlled public contracts, port operations, drug supply lines, local businesses, and the movement of people. To be born in Rosarno in the right family was to be born inside the organization, whether you chose it or not. Giuseppina Pesce was born in 1979 into the center of all of it. Her father was Salvatore Pesce, one of the primary bosses of the Pesce Nedrina, the clan's local unit within the broader 'Ndrangheta structure. Her uncle was Antonino Pesce, co-head of the same clan. The Pesce family at its height commanded approximately 500 affiliates and was described by Italian investigators as one of the most influential clans in the entire 'Ndrangheta, an organization that was, by 2010, generating an estimated $100 billion per year and controlling the majority of cocaine distribution across Europe. Growing up inside that family meant that Giusy, as she was known, had almost no choices about anything. She stopped attending school at 13 because the family would not permit her to study at a secondary school outside the village. She was not allowed to learn to drive. She was not allowed to leave the house without permission or a male escort. She was not permitted to keep up piano lessons. She had no bank account of her own. The world the 'Ndrangheta built for its women was a gilded cage with no door. At 13, she met Rocco Palaya in the village cemetery on the Day of the Dead. He was 20 years old. His father managed firearms for the Pesce clan's criminal network. The meeting had a quality that, in retrospect, felt like foreshadowing. Within 3 weeks of their relationship beginning, he hit her for the first time. She later told magistrates directly, "After only 3 weeks together, he gave me a first slap." She eloped with Palaya at 14. She gave birth to the first of their 3 children at 15. Her husband was soon imprisoned, leaving her alone with an infant and under the watch of the Pesce family structure. Palaya had not worked and had not taken care of the family even when he was present. Her father-in-law paid the rent. By her early 20s, Giusy was a mother of 3, effectively confined to Rosarno, married to a man in prison who had beaten her, and surrounded by family members who viewed any sign of independence as a threat to the clan's honor. She fell into a secret relationship with another man. In 'Ndrangheta culture, this was not simply a personal matter. An affair by the wife of a member, even a member in prison, was treated as a dishonor to the family, punishable by death. Women had been killed for less. Giusy knew what she was risking. She went ahead anyway, which is itself a measure of how desperate her existence had become. On the night of April 27th to 28th, 2010, Italian police launched Operation All Inside, a large-scale raid targeting the Pesce clan. 40 people were arrested. Among them was Giusy Pesce, 31 years old. Her 9-year-old son, Gaetano, was pretending to be asleep when the officers came. He told her afterward, "They said you had gone to hospital for an operation, like Papa, but I had realized they were taking you to prison." Also arrested in the same operation were Giusy's mother, Angela Ferraro, her sister Marina, her brother Francesco, and a large number of uncles and cousins. Her father and husband were already incarcerated. The entire visible structure of her world had collapsed in a single night. Giusy was facing more than a decade in prison, but the legal exposure was not what frightened her most. The newspaper coverage of the arrests had revealed that she had been detained alongside a man. Her affair was now public knowledge. In the 'Ndrangheta, that information was a death sentence. She understood with complete clarity that her family, once they processed what the papers were saying, would want her dead. Her 3 children would be raised by the clan without her. That was the future she was looking at. She asked to speak with prosecutor Alessandra Ceretti. Ceretti was a magistrate from Messina who had come to Calabria after working terrorism cases and had developed a theory that the 'Ndrangheta's treatment of women, its absolute control, its violence, its erasure of female identity, was also its greatest vulnerability. Women inside these families knew everything. They transmitted messages, managed money, maintained the household structures that kept men in hiding or in prison connected to their operations. And they were, in Ceretti's view, profoundly unhappy in ways that the organization refused to acknowledge or address. Giusy's first meeting with Ceretti in prison was, by the prosecutor's own account, tense. Giusy sat with the high-handed bearing of a boss's daughter. She offered a few pieces of information and demanded to be moved immediately into witness protection. Ceretti looked at her with equal directness and told her it did not work that way. Over weeks of meetings, the relationship shifted. Giusy began to talk seriously. She eventually signed a full cooperation agreement. Her testimony ran to more than 1,500 pages. What those pages contained was unprecedented in the history of Ndrangheta prosecutions.
Giusy provided detailed diagrams of the clan's hierarchy. She described initiation rituals that had never been documented by outside investigators. She gave the locations of bunkers where bosses lived when they were in hiding from police. She described murders and provided evidence connecting specific individuals to specific crimes. She named corrupt officials. She explained the internal economics of the organization, how money moved, how contracts were awarded, how the clan maintained control of port operations in Gioia Tauro. Ceretti described it afterward as stunning. Everything investigators had suspected about the scale and structure of the 'Ndrangheta was confirmed and extended by what Giusy gave them. The prosecutor said that Giusy saw the state not as the traditional enemy, but as an alternative for herself and her children. The Pesce family's response was immediate and methodical. They went after the one thing they knew would break her children. A long campaign began, using Giusy's kids as leverage. Family members sent messages. They told the children that their mother had abandoned them, that she had chosen strangers over her own blood, that she was a traitor who did not love them. They worked on the children to pressure Giusy, and they worked on Giusy directly through every channel available to them. The organization's view of the situation was not complicated. If she had cooperated in order to give her children a different future, she could be stopped by threatening that future. Under this pressure, Giusy recanted. She withdrew her testimony. The cooperation broke down. What brought her back was a murder. A woman who had also become an informant connected to cases in the same region was killed. Giusy watched what the 'Ndrangheta did to women who tried to leave and then came back into range. The killing clarified something that the months of family pressure had temporarily obscured. There was no safe middle ground. There was no version of events where she went home and everything was forgiven. The choice was always binary. Stay hidden and keep talking, or go back and die. She reinstated her cooperation. The testimony held. Based on what Giusy provided, Italian authorities carried out one of the largest asset seizures in the history of anti-mafia operations in Calabria. On April 21, 2011, police confiscated approximately 190 million euros worth of Pesce clan assets. The seized property included 40 businesses operating in transport, agriculture, and trade, 4 villas, 44 apartments, 60 parcels of land, 164 cars, and 2 football clubs, Interpiana and Sapri. The total value of property confiscated from the Pesces and the broader 'Ndrangheta based on her evidence was reported at approximately $260 million. 64 'Ndrangheta defendants were indicted. The trial of Pesce clan members began in 2012 and ran for 5 years before concluding. It was one of the most consequential prosecutions in the organization's history. The lead prosecutor was a woman. The central witness was a woman. The defendants, when they were led into the courtroom on the trial's first day, were visibly shaken to find both of those things to be true. Giusy's uncle, Rocco Pesce, one of the senior figures in the clan, issued a public condemnation of her that functioned as a death sentence within the organization's internal logic. His statement was reported as, "You have to kill a dog that does not look you in the eye." Giusy Pesce and her 3 children entered indefinite witness protection. They have been there ever since. They move at least once per year. They cannot contact anyone from their former lives. They live under names that are not theirs. Giusy has spoken about the existence in terms that make it sound like a different kind of imprisonment. Not a cage built from violence and family honor, but a cage built from isolation and permanent fear. She told one interviewer, "All of these experiences strengthened me as a woman. I knew the risks, but in the end, I did it." Her brother Francesco Pesce, arrested during Operation All Inside, was eventually convicted along with other clan members.
Her father, Salvatore Pesce, had already been in prison on drug trafficking charges since 2005. The clan she grew up in, the structure that had defined every aspect of her existence from birth, was dismantled in significant part because she decided that her children deserved a future that did not look like hers. The price of that decision is a life spent in hiding with no defined endpoint.
Rocco Pesce's death sentence against her has never been formally withdrawn. Other clan members will be released from prison over the coming years. Giusy and her children will continue moving, continue living under false names, continue waiting for a danger that has not arrived yet and may never arrive, or may arrive without warning. What she built with those 1,500 pages was real. What she lost in exchange was everything she had ever known. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Maria Concetta Cacciola was Giusy's childhood friend in Rosarno and made the same choice, walking into a police station and agreeing to talk about her family's crimes. But her story ended in a way that answers, with brutal finality, the question of what the 'Ndrangheta does to women who cannot stay away from the family they tried to leave. Maria Concetta Cacciola. She testified her family brought her home, and she was dead 10 days later. Rosarno in 2011 was a town that had already made international headlines once, in January 2010, when racial violence erupted between local residents and African immigrant workers who had been living in abandoned warehouses and picking citrus fruit for wages that amounted to a few euros a day. The violence was shocking enough to attract global media attention, but the story underneath the story, the reason Rosarno looked the way it did, the reason its economy worked the way it did, the reason its social structures were so rigid and so brutal, was the 'Ndrangheta. The Pesce clan and the families connected to them had controlled Rosarno so completely and for so long that the town's dysfunction was simply what life looked like when organized crime ran everything. Maria Concetta Cacciola was born into that town in 1980. She was born into one of its Mafia families, which in Rosarno meant she was born into a world that had already decided everything about her future before she was old enough to understand what a future was. Her family was connected to the broader network of 'Ndrangheta clans operating in and around Rosarno. Giuseppina Pesce, whose testimony had just shaken the Pesce clan to its foundations, was her cousin and her closest friend. They had grown up together in the same small world, under the same rules, watching the same things happen to women who stepped outside the boundaries the organization drew around them. Concetta, as people who knew her called her, married young. She met her future husband when she was 13 years old. He was 21. She had the first of their 3 children at 15. She conceived 2 of her children during conjugal prison visits because her husband was incarcerated for Mafia-related crimes during significant portions of their marriage. With her husband in prison, the responsibility for enforcing the family's honor code fell to her father, who took the role seriously in the most violent sense of the word. Her father monitored her movements constantly. On one documented occasion, he knocked her to the ground when she came home from a shopping trip later than expected. She was not permitted to leave the house without an escort. She was not permitted to speak to men outside the family. She had no financial independence, no freedom of movement, and no avenue of appeal against any of this, because the rules came from the organization itself, not from any individual she could argue with or negotiate with. By the time Concetta was in her late 20s, her life was, in the assessment of the investigators who later worked her case, functionally identical to house arrest. She was a prisoner in a home that was not legally a prison, guarded by family members who would have described what they were doing as protection. Investigators working under prosecutor Alessandra Cerretti, the same magistrate who had cultivated Giuseppina Pesce's cooperation, had been developing their understanding of how women inside these families could potentially be reached. Cerretti's theory was that the 'Ndrangheta's absolute control of women was its most exploitable weakness, because the women knew everything and had been given no reason whatsoever to stay loyal beyond fear. Concetta fit the profile of someone who might be willing to talk. She was isolated, she was unhappy, and she had information about her family's operations that prosecutors needed. At some point in 2011, Concetta walked into a police station and said she wanted to cooperate. This was an act of extraordinary courage, given what she knew about what happened to women in her world who made that choice. Lea Garofalo had been murdered less than 2 years earlier.
The message sent by Garofalo's killing had been received clearly across every 'Ndrangheta family in Calabria. Concetta walked into that police station knowing all of this. Investigators worked with her carefully over a period of weeks, establishing the seriousness of her commitment and the depth of what she knew. She provided testimony about her family's involvement in loan sharking, murder, and protection racketeering. The information was credible and useful. Ceretti's team moved her out of Rosarno and into a protected location. For the first time in her adult life, Concetta was somewhere her family could not reach her. Prosecutors and her lawyers were aware from the beginning that she had a vulnerability that the family would exploit the moment they identified it. That vulnerability was her children. The campaign began almost immediately. Family members made contact with Concetta's children and used them to send messages. They told the children that their mother had abandoned them. They told Concetta, through whatever channels they could find, that she would never see her children again if she did not come home. They worked every angle simultaneously: guilt, love, the specific and devastating grief of a mother separated from her kids. And they did it with the patience of people who had done this before and understood exactly which pressure points would eventually give way. Investigators bugged the family's car. They listened to the conversations happening inside it in real time. What they recorded was Concetta's own mother, in multiple conversations, systematically dismantling her daughter's resolve. The mother's recorded words included a direct ultimatum that prosecutors later described in court proceedings. "You are either with us or with them. If you do not come back now, you will never see any of them again." Ceretti and her team were listening. They were parked outside in cars on certain days, phones in hand, prepared to move at a moment's notice if Concetta signaled she was ready to leave the protected location with her children and disappear completely into the program. That was the plan. Get Concetta and get the kids out in a single movement before the family could respond. On August 10, 2011, Concetta made a decision that bypassed that plan entirely. She left the protected location on her own, without warning investigators in time to act, and returned to Rosarno to see her children. She had been in protection for less than 2 months. The investigators received the news and understood immediately what it meant. Concetta had gone back into the one environment where her family had total control over her movements, her communications, and her physical safety. The leverage she had given up by cooperating, the information, the testimony, the agreement with prosecutors, now existed in the hands of people who viewed it as a betrayal requiring a response. 10 days after she returned to Rosarno, on August 20th, 2011, Maria Concetta Cacciola was dead. She was 31 years old. She had 3 children. Her family's explanation was suicide. They said she had swallowed hydrochloric acid on her own. They presented this as a tragic act of self-destruction by a troubled woman. The investigators and prosecutors working the case did not believe this for a moment. Forensic and medical analysis of what hydrochloric acid does to the human body makes voluntary ingestion of a full bottle extraordinarily difficult to accept as an explanation. The acid causes severe burning pain from the instant it touches the lips and the inside of the mouth. The pain would be immediate and overwhelming. The idea that a person voluntarily continues swallowing under those conditions, past the first touch, past the first burning, all the way through a full bottle, was rejected by investigators as physically implausible. Italian journalist Giampaolo Latella, who covered the case and the broader 'Ndrangheta for Corriere della Calabria, described it in terms that captured the symbolic logic of the killing alongside the physical reality. He wrote that if a person wants to punish themselves for a mistake, they choose the rope. Acid is another thing. It is physically and metaphorically a way to shut someone up, to burn the mouth that spoke. Anti-mafia investigators and members of the Italian Parliament's Anti-Mafia Commission stated publicly that the 'Ndrangheta is entirely capable of engineering what appears to be a suicide. Angela Napoli, a Calabrian MP on the commission, said the bosses never accept rebellion from their women and are certainly capable of provoking suicide or staging one.
A long investigation into Concetta's death was launched. The investigation determined that she had not killed herself. The conclusion reached by investigators was that she had been murdered. Who specifically held the bottle or forced the acid down her throat has never been established to the standard required for a criminal conviction. The murder of Maria Concetta Cacciola remains officially unsolved. What is documented is what happened to the people around her afterward. Her mother, father, and brother were arrested and imprisoned for mafia-related crimes, and specifically for the physical violence that had characterized the environment Concetta lived in and died in. The lawyer Vittorio Pisani, who had represented the Cacciola family in proceedings connected to Concetta's case, was later convicted in proceedings related to the case. The family's role in creating the conditions of her death was acknowledged in the criminal justice system, even if the act of killing her was never pinned to a specific individual. Her children were raised by the 'Ndrangheta family that killed her. Enrico Fierro, a journalist who had written extensively about the 'Ndrangheta and covered Concetta's death from the beginning, described its meaning within the organization's internal logic with complete clarity. He said her death sent a message that could be understood by every woman in Calabria who was considering doing what Concetta had done. Whoever abandons the 'Ndrangheta is alone. Whoever betrays them will have no future and will lose everything: wealth, power, and the people they love. The timing of her death, coming less than 2 years after Lea Garofalo's murder, was not coincidental in its effect, even if the two cases were not operationally connected. Together, they formed a pattern. 2 women in the same region had cooperated with the same prosecutor's office. One had been lured to Milan by the man she had testified against and strangled, her body dissolved in acid. The other had been pulled home by her own mother and died in circumstances that looked like suicide and were not. The message sent by both deaths together was more powerful than either would have been alone. Prosecutor Ceretti and her team were in their cars outside the family home the day Concetta died. Their phones rang with the news before they had a chance to move. Ceretti had spent years arguing that the women inside these families were the key to dismantling an organization that had defeated every other investigative approach. She had been right. Giuseppina Pesce's testimony had proven that. But the cost of being right was paid by the women themselves, in witness protection rooms and in unmarked locations, and in homes in Rosarno, where people who were supposed to be family decided that silence was worth more than a daughter's life. Concetta's case, alongside Lea Garofalo's and Giuseppina Pesce's, became central to a broader debate in Italy about the adequacy of protections for testimoni di giustizia, citizen witnesses with no criminal record, whose legal status gave them weaker protections than convicted criminals who turned state's evidence. Lawyers and advocates argued for years that the distinction needed to change, that people like Concetta and Lea, who came forward without any obligation to do so, deserved stronger guarantees than the system was providing. Whether those changes came in time to matter for the next woman who walks into a police station in Rosarno or Petilia Policastro, or any other town in Calabria, and says she wants to talk, is a question the system has not yet fully answered. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.